Welcome, everybody. So for the last talk of the day regarding vineyards, we've got a talk today titled Techniques for Managing High Vigor Vineyards, or sections of your vineyard. I know that we're probably not all a very vigorous, or we're not growing in very vigorous sites for the most part, at least not like places like Virginia or Long Island or other things. But many of us may have sections that we planted through, or we're down on the valley floor, maybe we planted in the low area, the swale on our sites, or we have the end rows that, the vines just grow vigorously. And so these guys have experience in dealing with high vigor growing regions of the world, and they've got techniques that they've researched or looked into that help us look at novel approaches or maybe unique approaches beyond the ones that we're typically using here in the Willamette Valley in Oregon. Those approaches being cover crop in the aisle, maybe leaving a kicker cane, maybe leaving more buds per vine. Those are pretty standard. Today we'll have two guys who've explored things like cover cropping completely under the row, which is important because in the conversation today and the trend that's going on in the Willamette Valley, this idea of getting rid of herbicides completely and having full cover under your vine rows. Well, this may shed some light on what could happen to your vines if you go that route, and I think there's insight and things to be learned. So, hello, I'm Jason Tosch, Stoller Family Estate. I'm also on the wine board and am on that research committee, and so I am a representative of you guys to the wine board for research and other things. So please come to me about any issues you have out there and want to send up the line. Today I have, first off, Cain Hickey. Right here, Cain. He's from the University of Georgia, Department of Horticulture. Cain he's an assistant professor and a vit extension specialist there. Cain has been involved with research and extension since 2007, where he studied at Penn State and worked at Lake Erie Regional Grape Research and Extension Center during his undergrad, then went on to Virginia Tech to get his doctorate. And that's where he published a piece of work called Under Trellis Cover Crop and Rootstock Effect Growth, Yield Components, and Fruit Composition of Cab Sav. So Cain has a published doctorate in the area of cover cropping. So then after Cain, we will have Gill Giese. Gill is from the New Mexico State, University, where he is assistant professor and an extension vit specialist there. He's working on vit and enology research. Gill is also an accomplished commercial winemaker when he was studying getting his doctorate at Virginia Tech. So both these guys are Virginia Tech guys, which is interesting to me because somehow Oregon and Virginia have a pretty good bridge somehow. I don't know how that happened. In 2015, Gill published cover crop and root pruning impacts on vegetative growth, crop yield components, and grape composition of Cab Sav. So they will be shedding light on their work with cover cropping under vine, rootstock, and a thing called root pruning, which I think is an underutilized practice here in the valley for high vigor sites and beyond. So we'll start with Cain, and we'll save questions for the very end. Cain.
Okay, thanks, Jason.
Here's your clicker.
Cool. Thanks, man.
Yeah.
All right. Good afternoon. Thanks for having me out. This is great. Thanks, Jason, for the introduction. And so who has vigor issues? 10, 15%? Not saying. Well, vigor is not necessarily a bad thing, is it? I mean, well, we'll get into it. Let's talk about it. So today I'll be talking about some work that as Jason talked about, I did for some of my master's work, some of my PhD work, and I'm also going to be talking about some work that I took part in that was another gentleman's work named Bryson Hill, who's here on the title slide. Some root restriction work that I thought it might be interesting to share with y'all. So, talking about root stocks, cover crops, and root restriction, ways to attenuate vigor in your vineyard, if in fact you need to attenuate your vigor. Reckon I need to turn it on. There you go. It helps to turn things on. So vigor, it's often excessive, and as Jason said, in our climate back in the east, we get a lot of super optimal water availability throughout the season. It rains periodically. That's kind of different from here, as far as I understand. The faucet gets turned off, and you guys pretty much experience dry weather for the most part. Is that correct? And then you might get some late season rains creeping in, and maybe get some bunch rots from that. But otherwise, you guys tend to be somewhat dry during the growing season. But in our climate, a lot of times this is due to low evapotransitive demand. The climate itself doesn't demand a lot of water from the vine. It's relatively humid, and again, we get those rains throughout the season. And if you know what a plant moisture sensor machine is, what we know as pressure bombs, a lot of times when you cut a petiole off, put it in that thing, you don't need to pressurize the leaf too long before water starts gushing out of the leaf stem, just because it's full of water, whereas here that might be different. So what else? Nutrients. Nutrients are often not limiting as well, whether that be from the inherent parent material in the soil or grower-applied amendments, and so that doesn't help. If you're trying to take this analogy, if you're trying to take your foot off the gas pedal, but like putting nutrients on is like slamming your foot on the gas pedal. So why apply nutrients when you're trying to attenuate vigor? So when you talk about vigor, obviously vigor itself is not really the concern. It's the concern of what it does to your canopy and fruit zone is really the concern. And so here is a very old, not very old, but 27 years old now. Who has this book, Sunlight into Wine? If you own a vineyard or a vineyard manager, your hand better be up, right? But basically, these are the microclimate differences in a canopy and fruit zone on a sparse and dense canopy. So with dense canopies, that's typically the situation in high vigor vines, but in a sparse canopy, if vigor is a little lower, you'll have those. And most would agree that all the characteristics, the interior of a sparse canopy are probably more ideal than that of a dense canopy. Whether it be for getting temperature and radiation increase on your fruit to increase tannin polymerization or color if you're not in a color limiting temperature region, things like that, but also to limit diseases and get good spray penetration into that canopy. So again, why do we care about excessive vine growth? Because it has potential to limit quality. This is a picture of a Cabernet Sauvignon cluster. It looks like it should be at veraison, but that's at harvest. Who wants to drink wine made from something like that? I don't. But yeah, so that was the interior of a very dense canopy, no leaf removal, and you see a lot of those grapes didn't get any light. That's why they're green and pink. And of course, that's where we see the botrytis bunch rot. So yeah, it can limit quality through disease, quality, quantity, maybe if the interior gets shaded enough and you get less fruitful buds. Of course, you all tend to cane prune out here, so a lot of the buds, your fruiting buds are up in the canopy rather than closer to the fruit zone. But back east, spur pruning is popular, so if the fruit zone doesn't get a lot of light and penetration, then you could reduce basal bud fruitfulness. But because of these things, we care about regulating vegetative growth. Why does Oregon care about reducing vine vigor? Why is it? Is it because folks think that it improves quality, or is it because y'all just don't want to go out and hedge as much? Yes, both? Yeah. And the whole vigor-quality relationship, I've never seen, that'd be such a hard study to try to single out one causal factor resulting in the wine quality. I mean, because usually low vigor vines also have more open fruit zones. And so you wonder, is it vigor itself, or is it the fact that you're just getting more light into the fruit zone? Oftentimes, lower vigor vines also have smaller berries, so you have a higher surface area, higher skin to flesh ratio in the must, and it could be a concentration effect. So it's hard to tease out what exactly we think is increasing quality in low vigor vines. Or is it just anecdotal and dogmatic because France had low vigor vines and that's what we think makes good wine? I'm not to say, but these are possibilities. So just some pictures here. A tight VSP, it's really, this is in Virginia. This is a really aesthetically pleasing, I think most would agree, it's a really aesthetically pleasing site. But it's also not a workhorse. In this situation, these are high vigor vines. They get there though from hedging a lot and making them look like a nice, pretty landscaped hedgerow. You also limit fruit production to a very confined fruit zone. I'm not saying it's bad, but this is not a workhorse type situation. They're not using the vigor potential of this to maybe crop. Use that to crop. Rather, they're combating it by hedging and still maintaining that fruit production in that really confined space. Now here's a situation where it's a modified ballerina, so I tried to draw the red line along the fruit zone, the axis of the fruit zone there where they split the canopy. So this is a type of VSP, it's a modified ballerina where they just throw out these shoots off the side of the cordon, and they call it their solar collector. So they collect more sun throughout the day. You can imagine in a situation like this, especially in the hours surrounding solar noon, you're not intercepting that much sunlight. Here, you're intercepting a lot of sunlight. It looks terrible, but put these on the back 40 and let them produce fruit for you. You don't have to let your guests see these. These produce wonderful fruit. This is at the top of a mountain in Virginia. Gets really good breeze, really good air movement. They probably get 6.5, 7 tons per acre off this system. Sounds like overcropping, but I would disagree. And the other thing is, too, in the East Coast, we have so much vigor. I have yet, this vine balance thing. 10 is when you think about crop load, it's crop weight to pruning weight. And I have yet to see that ratio approach 10 in the East Coast, which means to me that we have an excessive amount of vegetative growth compared to crop. So it's almost like we couldn't even overcrop the vine if we tried because we have so much vegetative vigor. So this guy's using that vigor and saying, well, if you're going to grow big, I'm going to crop big. And he produces nice fruit. So most would agree this is not what you want to see. So we do things like that, and that's the same canopy just after hedging, and you have that nice tight hedgerow look, which, yeah, it's certainly a more healthier looking canopy, a lot more air movement. You don't have canopy self-shading. This is going to be a much more healthier environment to produce fruit in. So again, I asked that question, you guys said yes. And so when you have vigor, you have to combat it. You have to regulate it. And so typically, we do that through remedial measures, leaf removal, lateral hedging, especially after the first time you do your shoot topping. Those laterals break, and then you're out there. It seems like it could be every 2 to 3 weeks. Again, Jason said it's site dependent, and it is. Not all sites are going to see that, but if you're on a 25% slope site, you might not see it. But if you're down on pretty high organic matter, low sloped site, you might have to go out there and do that a lot. And all these take time and cost money, and so we don't want to do those things. So as opposed to remedial, what I'm going to talk about today is proactive. So doing things before you need to pull out that hedger or pull leaves or cut laterals. Things like site selection, that's your best proactive vine size management. I mean, from the get-go, choosing a site for your vineyard, you're already talking about how that canopy is going to be shaped and how it's going to grow on that site. So site selection is paramount. Cultivar selection is another one. Cab Sauv and Sauv Blanc are super vigorous cultivars compared to some others. Rootstock selection, we'll talk about that. Vine spacing, I don't know so much about vine spacing, if that really affects vigor. Resources have to be limited, so I tend to think that if you plant vines 3 feet apart versus 6 feet apart, if those 3 feet apart vines are not resource limited, if they have enough water, if they have enough nutrients to go around, then there's not really competition. There's only competition when resources are limited. Trellis system. You can manage vine size with trellis system. Pruning methods, cane versus spur. Y'all out here, cane. Back east, folks are somewhat afraid of that. Most folks spur, although cane is becoming more popular back east. We'll talk about under trellis cover crops and root restriction as well. So why use cover crops? Mostly to accommodate vineyard equipment. But also to limit erosion, limit compaction, to maintain soil structure. But under trellis, we can, on really highly sloped sites, under trellis cover crops might keep your soil in place and reduce erosion. So that's a benefit of having cover crops under the vine, especially if you're on a highly sloped site. It maintains your soil in place. Improve soil health. There's been some work done that shows that cover crops improve their overall organic health of your soil, organic matter, beneficial microbes. Reducing vigor through competition, we'll talk about that. And what about improving fruit composition? There's been some work showing that it does affect it and some work that shows that it doesn't affect it too much. So why use rootstocks? Basically, originally it's to tolerate soil-borne pests like phylloxera and nematodes. But rootstocks are rated for a lot of different things. And here I show this table showing their rating for vigor, conferral, drought tolerance, phylloxera tolerance. So we looked at 101-14, 420A, and Riparia gloire in our study, and we'll talk about those. But that's why we chose those, because they were at the lower end of the vigor conferral, but also had some differences between them. So that's why we chose to compare those 3 rootstocks, which I'll talk about. So this talk has 2 parts. It's a cover crop and a rootstock study in Cabernet Sauvignon over 6 years, and then at the end I'll talk about this root restriction work that we've done, and I'll present 2 years of data on that. So basically our question was, can we proactively regulate vine size through the use of rootstocks or under trellis cover crops? So our treatments were either a conventional herbicide strip underneath the vine or cover crops grown right up to the trunk of the vine, and planted in both of those situations, we had all 3 rootstocks. So all 3 rootstocks in an herbicide strip and all 3 rootstocks with cover crops grown. And we use creeping red fescue, and I mention that because this particular cover crop goes dormant about August in our climate. And just keep that in mind, because that has important implications for some of the results, I think. Oh, I should note that these vines were planted in 06. It's Cabernet Sauvignon Clone 337. They're spur pruned, cordon trained. The vines were planted in 06, but the cover crop was established in 08. And I think y'all know, but if you plan on establishing cover crops, it's best to wait at least a couple years after vineyard establishment, because you want to keep those babies from having too much competition. Their root systems are small and they're at the surface level, so limiting competition, especially in those first 2 years, is important. So vigor really is a measurement of growth or some growth over time. So we looked at shoot growth rate. CC stands for cover crop, HTS stands for herbicide treated strip, and you can see that cover crop reduced shoot growth rate, daily shoot growth rate when compared to the herbicide treated strip. So reduced by about 0.6 centimeters a day. So that adds up. So we did see some vigor reduction with the cover crops. Here's pruning weights. Those red lines basically indicate the upper threshold for the ideal canopy as far as pruning weights go, which is 0.3 to 0.6 kilograms per meter a row. So you can see on the top graph there, we have herbicide treated strip and cover crop. The cover crop in some years came close to hitting that upper threshold, but the point here is that we didn't get within that range. So these vines are still at the high capacity end of things. And then none of the rootstocks got us down below into that range either. However, Riparia did tend to tend to reduce pruning weights in some years compared to 101-14 and 420A. As you can see, cover crop pretty consistently reduce pruning weights compared to the herbicide-treated strip. So again, we're showing that cover crop is having an effect on reducing vegetative growth in these vines. And in rootstock, not as much, but Riparia tended to be the lower vigor rootstock. Fruit zone microclimate aberration, basically CEL is cluster exposure layer, CEFA is cluster exposure flux availability. It's a fancy way of saying radiation, light getting to the fruit zone. And as you can see, when you grow vines with cover crops, you get more light to the fruit zone, and your cluster exposure layer, your leaf layer, goes down. So again, this is not with us intervening. These are all proactive measures. This is just letting the cover crop or the herbicide strip or the rootstock take their effect on the canopy architecture. And so we thought this was a positive response to see that growing vines with the cover crop opened up the fruit zone a bit without us intervening at all. And rootstocks didn't have any effect on fruit zone microclimate. I just wanted to bring this up briefly, the tissue nutrient concentration. There's a lot of data here, but I'll summarize it for you pretty much. We saw nitrogen competition exerted by the cover crop relative to the herbicide-treated strip. So vines grown with herbicide strip tended to have higher nitrogen levels than those grown with a companion cover crop underneath the trellis. And so that was a response. We just think that some of the nitrogen's getting tied up when it's applied with that cover crop. As far as potassium goes, 420A tended to have lower potassium levels, and we'll talk about that in a couple slides here. But 420A had lower potassium levels pretty consistently when compared to 101-14 and Riparia. Here's that pressure bomb I was talking about that's made in Albany. I think it's Albany, Oregon, right? Yeah, right down the road. These figures basically, vine hydration status, midday stem water potential is a fancy way of saying how hydrated is the vine. The more negative this number, the more water stressed the plant is. And these graphs basically show that between the cover crop and the rootstock treatments, there really was no difference in stem water potential. So the cover crop or the rootstocks were not having effect on vine hydration status and competing for the vine with water. What about yield? Cover crops tended to depress yield a little bit compared to the herbicide-treated strip, and it was mainly a function of cluster weight reduction. And the top left figure, is basically, it was due to a reduction in berry numbers per cluster. So there was fewer berries per cluster in the cover crop treatments compared to the herbicide treatment, which resulted in lower cluster weight, which resulted in lower yields. Anybody venture a guess why there was lower cluster weights and lower berry numbers in those cover crop plots? Yeah, probably lower sets. So who said that? Alex? Yeah. Because I just presented that nitrogen data, we thought we might have affected fruit set. And then rootstock, it was interesting. I showed you that Riparia reduced pruning weight, but Riparia actually produced higher yields. And this was mainly, again, they had higher cluster weights, but it was through higher berry weights. Riparia tend to produce larger berries, which translated into larger cluster weights and ultimately higher yields than 101-14 and 420A. So Riparia had this interesting effect where it produced lower canopy growth, but more vegetative growth. So maybe getting vines more in the balanced range. Fruit composition. Generally unremarkable effects. So these are anthocyanins and phenolics. And besides 420A generally having lower values, especially in total phenolics and anthocyanins compared to 101-14 and Riparia, cover crop in the cover crop and the herbicide strip really didn't have much differences between these total phenolics and anthocyanins. Over there on the left there is pH, and you can see in almost every year, I didn't put year on the x-axis, that's supposed to be year, sorry about that. 420A tended to have lower pH, and we'll talk about that in just a second here. So here's the general discussion take home from part one, this rootstock comparison and the cover crop comparison, then we'll go and talk about root restriction. But under trellis cover crops appear to compete with vines for nitrogen more so than water. And this raises an eyebrow because I think most folks anecdotally think, well, surely there's got to be some water competition there. But the reality is at least in our conditions with the cover crop we chose, this cover crop I said was going dormant in August. Well, guess what happens in August? That's when veraison starts. And so you basically get this thatching, mulching effect, and it actually tends to, what we think, retain soil moisture more so than the herbicide-treated strip, which is bare soil, which tends to evaporate water quicker. And so there's more than meets the eye. I mean, you think, oh, there's something else growing there. There's got to be competition for water. Maybe if you plant it in the first couple years because the root systems are at the same level, but in this clod work that I cite here, what we're finding is that, or what she found and reported on in that paper, is that the vines growing with the companion cover crops have a higher population of roots and lower soil profiles. So they're exploring deeper soil niches to get away from that competition of the cover crops. So they're happy. The cover crop roots are happy, the vine roots are happy, and so again, there was no water competition, and that's why we think so. Both those reasons. The vine roots were growing deeper in the cover crop plots, but also the cover crop was going dormant, serving as a mulch and retaining soil moisture. The other thing is that cover crops help infiltrate water. You think of a hard rain, it really crusts over the bare soil, and water runs off and away, whereas cover crops can help infiltrate water. So again, there's a lot more than meets the eye with these under trellis cover crops. I'm not saying this would be the case on all your sites, but that's what we found on our site in our conditions. 428 may limit wine pH. I showed you that it had lower juice pH, and we think that's an indirect potassium effect. I also showed you that it tended to be a potassium excluder, and this work has been shown before. Jim Wolpert published some work talking about rootstocks with Berlandieri heritage, which is 428, tend to be potassium excluders. So for you winemakers out there, that could be a good thing in terms of keeping pH lower, because potassium can have indirectly increased wine pH. Yes, sir.
Just a quick question. What would be your seasonal rainfall total during the growing season, especially during that period of July and August?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that question.
But it's significant, and then coupled with your low ETs.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah.
I'm sorry?
I'm just trying to put this together.
Yeah, okay. So under trellis cover crops regulated vine growth more so than rootstock choice. Fruit composition was marginally affected, but generally unremarkable. And riparian increased crop yield, but tended to reduce pruning waste compared to the other rootstocks, while cover crop reduced crop yield through berry number per cluster. And again, as Alex said, it was probably through reduced set, although we didn't measure set. All right, let's talk about root restriction. This is what these root bags look like. We put them in at planting, and we dig the hole, fill these bags of soil, and put them back in the hole. So it's almost like bonsai vine growing. So there's two small studies within this. We're looking at root restriction to the point of 0.15 meters cubed versus freely growing roots, non-root manipulated roots, that's NRM. And then there's another side project, and these are much shorter than the first one that we looked at. We looked at 3 different volumes of root restriction. So we looked at 0.026, 0.035, and 0.058 meters cubed versus freely growing roots, which is the NRM. Anytime you see NRM that's not grown in a root bag, that's just like y'all would plant them normally. So these are 2-year studies in Cabernet Sauvignon, Clone 337. Again, low bilateral cordon train, spur prune to VSP. So when you look at shoot growth, you can see that growing vines in these 0.015 meter cube bags really attenuated shoot growth. I mean, it almost halved it compared to the freely growing roots. That right there is what the canopy looked like right around veraison. And that's without any intervention, any hedging, any leaf removal, anything. So what do you all think about that canopy? I like it. I mean, it's airy, a lot of air movement through there. Almost every leaf in that canopy is intercepting light. There's not a lot of canopy self-shading. So yeah, that's pretty nice for not doing any hedging. Pruning weight. So what we found, again, looking at this 0.3 to 0.6 kilograms per meter a row pocket for an ideal vine size, what we found is that these 0.015 bags were almost being too restrictive of vine growth. And hence the next study I'll talk about, where we looked at larger volumes of root restriction, because in this trial we were like, well, this might be too limiting, so almost uneconomical amounts. So, but the root restriction to this 0.015 meters cubed volume had a lot of these characteristics that's cited in Sunlight into Wine. The shoot length was dialed right in, hardly any lateral shoot development. Again, this is another picture of that canopy right around veraison. And again, I think y'all would agree that that's a pretty healthy, nicely balanced canopy. The shoot tips, when you look at the tendrils above the shoot at veraison, we like to see those upsized, or at least not really hanging turgid above, actively growing. And these, a lot of the shoot tips had upsized and die off in these root restriction plots by veraison. This is just a fair warning. On the left here, you have stem water potential. On the right, you have photosynthetic rate. You can see the nice parallel patterns. When a vine gets water stressed, it closes its stomates. When it closes its stomates, it can't exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide with the environment. When it doesn't get carbon dioxide, photosynthetic rate goes down. So that's what we thought we were seeing here, and again, you can see that pattern pretty well. The green bar is 0.015 meters cubed volume root restriction without irrigation. And so this is just saying that in some years, if you use these root bags, it might be nice to have companion irrigation ready to roll, especially in super dry seasons, which it sounds like you guys are pretty dry in most seasons. So if you're going this route, I would recommend considering irrigation in tandem with it. Because when we did irrigate, which is the blue line, stem water potential and photosynthetic rate more closely paralleled that of the freely growing roots. Does that make sense? So crop yield was reduced. Again, we thought this was a little bit too much restriction. 36% reduction in crop yield. It reduced crop due to reduced berry weight, reduced berry numbers, reduced cluster weight, but we had similar cluster number per vine with these. What do we got here? Yeah, it increased anthocyanins a little bit compared to the freely growing roots, but does that difference in anthocyanins translate into sensorially observed differences in the wine glass? I couldn't say. So really, that's practically what matters. I can show you these numbers and tell you they're statistically different, but you guys should care about it only if it makes a difference in the finished wine, and I couldn't say if it did or not. These two vintages were drastically different, and I put these up here just to basically say that we think that Brix were a little lower in 2010 because it was a dry year, and when you restrict these roots, they weren't getting water, and we think we were getting some photosynthetic shutdown, and they weren't accumulating sugar as much, and so they had reduced Brix. And then 2011, they had decreased pH and lower TA, possibly because fruit exposure was higher in these plots, and so it was driving off some malic acid, and we had lower TA in that. All right, let's talk about the three different size bags, and then I'll get off the stage and let Gill go. We looked at 0.026, 0.035, and 0.058 meters cubed root restriction versus non-root manipulated. So again, we thought 0.015 was too restrictive, so we went bigger and tested these three different sizes. So the 0.026 and 0.035 produced pruning weights that were right in that zone. So they were higher than the 0.015, but not so high that they would be considered unbalanced, at least based on what Smart and Robinson said in '91. Whereas 0.056 didn't look like it was restrictive enough, and of course the non-root manipulated were just high capacity vines. So this nice linear response was nice to see. The more root restriction you had, the less pruning weight you had. Crop yield. This was a really encouraging response because crop yield was not affected by these. And so again, we're getting some really nice balanced canopies with the 0.026 and 0.035 meter cube volumes, but yet we're not reducing crop yield. And so that's a good sign, and we were happy to see that response. Soluble salt, there wasn't great differences in fruit composition. 2016 soluble solids were increased in all root restriction situations. And what does that one mean?
That we have keeping track of time.
Okay, is that 1 minute?
We've got until fall.
Okay. All right, I'm almost done. Thank you. But at any rate, in 2016, we thought these soluble solids might have been increased due to dehydration, not actually a photosynthetic increase. Titratable acidity tended to be lower in these root restriction plots, and again, we think is because the open canopies probably increased sunlight penetration into the fruit zone and drove off some malic acid, and resulting in overall lower titratable acidity. Anthocyanins tended to be increased, especially in the lowest volume restriction, the 0.026 meters cubed, especially relative to the freely growing non-root manipulated plots. And total phenolics, which is absorbance at 280, it's an estimation, tended to be increased with all three root restrictions when compared to the freely growing roots, especially again in that smallest volume root restriction. What about how long it takes to manage? What would your labor savings be if you implemented some of these treatments, some of this root restriction? Again, it's almost a linear response. So basically, the take home here is that your labor spent on canopy management, you could reduce it by 5 to 9 hours per acre, labor hours per acre, compared to if you just planted these vines on freely growing roots, the NRM. So leaf removal took less time, hedging took less time when you restricted the roots. So earlier when I asked if you guys like low vigor because you don't have to hedge as much, well, here's some quantitative time savings based on our data and what you got with root restriction. So Jason said it earlier. It's really a question of your site. Use tools to match your site and your production goals. If you have a high clay site, high organic matter, flat land versus rocky, low organic matter, slope land, you're going to probably, you wouldn't want to use the root restriction on a site that's already has really low vine vigor. So kind of use some of these tools to match to your specific site, to your specific block, whatever it is, however, refined you want to get in your vineyard. But if you're planting down there where it says cold air, you might need to use some of these proactive management tools. However, if you're planting up where the vineyard is, maybe you don't need these so much, or maybe you just want cover crops because it helps limit soil erosion. But don't ubiquitously apply these. Just think of them and match them to help you manage your specific site based on your production goals. Cover crops may provide tandem vineyard benefits, soil health, reduced leaching, erosion. But again, wait until year 2 or 3 to establish them. Watch your nitrogen levels and choose species wisely. Again, we use creeping red fescue. It went dormant right around veraison, which helped us. We thought it was a good thing. Riparia worked well. It tended to attenuate vegetative growth, but also it tended to bump up crop yield without affecting quality potential. If you're experimenting with root restriction, again, I would say that irrigation is almost a necessity just to save yourself, because the inside of those bags where the roots are, they will dry out. Choose volume wisely. In this situation, I would recommend you trying something more than 0.026 meters cubed in volume, but that was in a humid climate, so maybe you want to go up to 0.035 or a little higher if you want to try this. I would not recommend somebody doing this in their whole vineyard, but if you wanted to do a couple experimental rows, why not? I think this is my last slide, yeah. So Russ, thanks for this picture. Russ gave me this picture, and if you don't know what this is, this guy's harvesting money, and because those grapes are money. And it's funny, Russ got this picture made, and he paid, I think you paid somebody for this, right? it's terrible because if you're paying somebody, you should at least make it a nice picture. But at any rate, this guy's harvesting money, and I'm telling you what it is because you can't see that. But farming is a business, so a lot of times you need quantity and quality, and you can have both. Earlier, when I showed that picture of that vine on the modified ballerina, those gentlemen were farmers before they were vineyard owners, and so they like to see fruit. And it works out for them. They make really nice products, and they're independent grape growers. They sell all their fruit. So maybe that has something to do with their desire to produce those crop levels. But they're farmers first, and they know that it's a business. So there's a lot of situations I've seen in some pretty high crop vineyards that produce some beautiful fruit. I'll just leave it at that. So I really can't thank y'all enough for having me out. I want to thank Russ for the invitation, and Sierra and Bree, and of course Jason. Thanks a lot for moderating. And Gil's up next. Thanks to Gill and my old advisor and some other fellows that worked with us at Virginia Tech. This is a brown trout from the mountains of western North Carolina, about 2.5 hours from where we live right now. And when I have a captive audience, I like to show fish pictures and baby pictures, so you guys got the fish. So apologies, but that's just an invitation. If you get sick of talking about wine and grapes here and you see me, come talk about trout. Thanks.
Good afternoon. My name is Gill Giese. I'm a viticulture extension specialist at New Mexico State University. And as we go through the slides, you'll notice, Jason introduced me as getting a degree at Virginia Tech, but the work was done in North Carolina. And I'm currently working in New Mexico, speaking in Oregon, and I grew up in Arkansas, so go figure. So first of all, I'd like to thank Russell Moss for reaching out and inviting me. I would also like to thank Bree and Sierra for logistical support. I would like to thank Jason and Cain for helping me focus more on what needs to be said today, and the Oregon Wine Board for having me, and for all of you for attending this afternoon. So this work is today's talk actually is a reflection of some aspects of my work that I did over about a 12-year period. The first 6 years were dedicated towards the PhD, and the last 6 years took place when I was working as a winemaker at the vineyard in which the experiment took place. So just keep that in mind. This experiment is not real neat and tidy because it occurred in a commercial vineyard, and as you know, things happen there. So the first 6 years were kind of intense with the PhD program going on. The last 6 years were kind of intense as a winemaker, viticulturist there at the vineyard. So we have the first slide. It's some boxes. And we have more boxes. Okay. The boxes are filled up. So if you look on your left, those are the guard vines. The middle box, the smallest vines, they were subjected to under trellis or intra-row trellis or complete vineyard floor trellis. Anyway, the grass was under the vines, okay? And so they had grass under the vines and they were root pruned. And then the last box in the, I guess it's towards your right, that just had the cover crop, okay? So just I'll provide some context between North Carolina and Oregon, hopefully, and then we'll look at the treatments which were pretty straightforward, just root pruning, cutting the roots, and planting grass under the vines. And then we'll talk about what happened. So that's the what part, and that's pretty easily done. You just measure what happened. It doesn't really address the why, and I'm still thinking about the why, so maybe y'all can help me with that part. But we do think it has something to do with the roots, it has something to do with soil moisture, and it probably has something to do with nitrogen. Then finally, I have a slide at the end in which I will hopefully give you one or two things you can take home to your vineyard. I don't know about you all, but when I go to these things, I like to take at least one thing home that I can tell my wife, yeah, I got something useful from going to that for 3 days. North Carolina is an interesting state grape-wise. It has basically two grape industries, muscadines, the Muscadinia rotundifolia, and it also has vinifera, hybrids, and native grapes that we refer to as bunch grapes. So if you look at this photograph of the, or cartoon of the state of North Carolina, you notice down towards the water, the Atlantic Ocean, is the coastal plain sandhills area where most of the muscadines are grown. And then in the middle of the state, which is referred to as the Piedmont, with rolling hills, that is where most of the vinifera is grown, and some hybrids as well. And then in the far western part where Cain caught that excellent trout are the mountains. And so we do have some mountains over 6,000 feet in that mountain range. Where this experiment took place is represented by that star there at a place called Shelton Vineyards. It encompasses about 100 acres of vinifera. It was all vinifera planted there, and it got started in about the year 1999. North Carolina has about, what's it say there, 186 wineries, probably closer to 200 now, 200 bonded wineries. And then it has about 500 vineyards and about 2,500 acres of vinifera grapes altogether. Just as a point of context, the muscadine industry is pretty big there. There's one producer there that bottles over 1 million cases a year of muscadine wine. So looking at some rainfall data, a gentleman asked earlier, well, how much does it rain there? I put this little slide together, and you can see, if you look at the lower chart there, the differences in rainfall. Where I did this experiment, it gets somewhere between 40 and 63 inches of rain. I measured 63 inches of rain one year, and a lot of that happens during the growing season, which is opposite of Oregon. You can see the black bars represent Salem, Oregon, and the orange represent an area in southern Oregon at Medford. So we're at least as warm as Medford, and we get more rain than either place. So we do get a lot of rain during the growing season, typically over 4 inches a month during June, July, and August. We're generally warmer. We're about a Winkler. If you want to look at the Winkler regions, we're about a region 4, some years pushing a region 5. It's that warm. We have a long frost-free growing season. It's nearly 210 days frost-free. And we have deep, fertile soils. If you look at that picture, that's about a 12-foot excavation where we built to put in a wine storage facility. About 6 feet is unrestricted. This is a very clay-type soil. The state soil for the state soil of North Carolina is the Cecil clay loam, and this is representative of that type of soil. It's fairly deep, well-drained. It has a fairly high iron content and pretty fertile. Where this experiment took place was actually a retired dairy farm, even though many of the producers there are planting on former tobacco farms. So what's the issue? And I think Cain covered it rather well. It's the excessive vigor. And these are some of the outcomes from excessive vigor that I ran across. It was the first time in my life, and I started pruning grapes in the late 70s. I started pruning Concord grapes in Arkansas, juice grapes, and I had never seen foliar botrytis until I moved to North Carolina. And there it is, foliar botrytis. That was the year we had 63 inches of rain. We also have some of the things that happen due to that excessive moisture, and you can see the uneven shoot growth at harvest, and then the canopy management that's required, and then some botrytis there at the end. Just put a finer point on it. As far as competition, this is a meter-by-meter planting that a grower attempted. It's about 3.5 feet apart in the row vine spacing, and the rows are about 4 feet apart, 4.5 feet apart. This is Sauvignon Blanc. And this poor guy is trying to cut his way out of it. What the grower eventually did is he took out every other vine in every other row. and got no reduction in yield, and of course management went down. So this little incident here pretty much convinced me that vine-to-vine competition wasn't going to work. So the problem is excessive vine vigor. The hypothesis was pretty straightforward. Let's plant some grass under the vines and cut the roots. Hopefully we'll limit the water and nitrogen they get or have access to, and we'll optimize vine size and hopefully impact berry composition and maybe even make better wine. The objectives are listed there for you. Assess agronomic performance of ground cover is one of my favorites. In my committee, they said, what's the agronomic performance of ground cover? I don't know if they just didn't like the word agronomy. I kind of like the word agronomy, but in this instance, it had to do with biomass of the ground covers. We measured that, and it also had to do with stand density of the ground covers. How long did they last, and how long did they stand up to foot traffic and tractor traffic? And then we want to describe and quantify the treatment effects on the vine. So that's a little bit more of what happened. What happened to the vine, shoots, roots, the berries, and ultimately the wine. And then what are the long-term effects on a vineyard after you expose it to these ground covers over a length of time. This is the experiment that was set up in that field. This was set up on Cabernet Sauvignon, clone 8, on rootstock SO4. The vines were planted in they were planted in the year 2000. The experiment was initiated in 2005, so they were 5 or 6 years old when this was initiated, and it ran through 2011, and then I kind of extended that, and it ran through this past growing season through 2017, so I have about 12 years of data on these same vines. So that's one replication there. And if you see the different colors, they represent the different grasses we used. And we used 5 different cool season grasses. We used 2 different fescues, the Kentucky 31 fescue and a turf-type fescue, Elite 2. Then we used Roundup tolerant fescue, which was Aurora Gold. And then we used perennial ryegrass, and we also used orchard grass. And then so the control or the grower standard treatment was the herbicide strip underneath the vines. And there they are in the spring, about the time we initiated the root pruning. This is how the grasses look. So you can see the 2 fescues, the Aurora Gold, the perennial ryegrass, the orchard grass, and the Elite 2. About the time these things broke bud and got about 2 or 3 inches of growth is when we cut the roots on them. This is what they look like, just a visual so you have some context. This is what the vines look like about flowering. The big feathery grass you see in the foreground, in both of the instances, that's some orchard grass. And then the one that has the grass underneath the vines, that's the pasture-type fescue, Kentucky 31. So initially, the first year, how we root pruned was with the proverbial ditch witch. So we dug a trench on each side of the vines about 2 feet deep, about 18 inches from the vine trunks, and then filled it back in. That was a little bit tedious. So we went to just using a vibratory plow, something that these plumbers and installers use to do cable lines. And so that's what this fella's doing for me there. He's just cutting the roots with a vibratory plow that we fitted a shank to that went down over 2 feet on each side of the vines, about 18 inches away from the vines. So any questions on what happened? I mean, these vines were about 5, 6 years old, Cab-Sauv clone 8, rootstock SO4, and then we cut them. We cut the roots every spring for 5 years. And we also had this grass growing under them, so a double insult. So just looking at ground cover, if you look at this, there's a pointer. Okay, so the Kentucky 31 fescue was significantly more than most of the others. Elite 2 came in somewhat behind, and the Aurora Gold, the Roundup tolerant fescue, was also significantly different than the others. But the take home of this is a grower, you might say, okay, that one's producing more grass. It probably competed more. Well, you would be mostly right. Looking at stand density, which was a numerical ranking that we gave, this is something that the golf course guys used when they're ranking turf grass. We used this numerical ranking to see how persistent the grasses were out in the field. What were they really doing? And so the Kentucky 31 stood up pretty well, and so did the Elite 2, both under the trellis and in the vine row. The others did not. And so for the rest of today's talk, I'll pretty much ignore the perennial ryegrass, the orchard grass, and the Aurora Gold, and concentrate on the 2 fescues. Looking at shoot growth rate in 2006, where we went out and measured shoots every week, you can see both in the non-pruned group, regardless the non-pruned, the line that sticks above on that curve, that's the herbicide strip. So when everything was not root pruned but was exposed to grass, the grasses had lower shoot growth rate in centimeters per day. Then in the root pruned group, you can see the same kind of phenomenon happened. And if you remembered Cain's slides, these vines were fairly vigorous. We were up to over 3 centimeters per day in growth. And if you look at the graphs, some of them push 4.5 centimeters of growth per day, which is about over 2 inches of shoot growth a day. Let's spend some time on this slide. If you look at it, it's pruning weights over time. So from 2005 through 2017, last year, there's a gap in the middle. I think that was a period of heavy drinking, so no data was collected. But actually what happened there is I got close to finishing the PhD and had to do some writing at that point. So starting off, if you look in this zone here, that's that 0.3 to 0.6, that magic zone that's supposed to be the desired amount of pruning weight in kilograms per meter of vine row. And you can see that there's a couple treatments that hang out down there, namely the Elite 2 fescue. The Elite 2 fescue, when we root pruned, it stayed in that zone pretty well throughout the course of the experiment. Now, knowing that this is a commercial vineyard, you know some things go on. Well, we had a dry year in 2007. Bam, all the pruning weights dropped. Didn't do a thing besides turn off the water. Then, about the time of that gap, actually what happened there is these things were cordon pruned forever, or since they had been planted, until about 2011 I went out and the guys had cane pruned everything. So I didn't collect data for a couple years, but remember that the vines were shifted to canes at this point. Then over here, with that big jump in pruning weights, this is a year that no hedging was imposed. So typically these vines were hedged 3 times a year, but this is a year, actually I asked them to do that. I said, okay, just withhold hedging in my little patch, which is about 2 acres in this 18-acre vineyard, which is surrounded by the other 100 acres. So that year we did not hedge, and the ones exposed to grass were able to pretty much attenuate pruning weights. Some other take-homes here. 2006, pay attention to that year. That is a year when somebody didn't thin the crop, because a contingency of this experiment was not to let crop vary. So every year, we didn't want that to be a factor, so every year we were thinning to 36 shoots, 18 shoots and 36 clusters, except 2006. 2006, that didn't get done. So that was another thing to keep in mind. And I think the take home from this is this is kind of a real life situation. This is a real life vineyard over time. Nonetheless, the grasses were able to keep the pruning weights in the magic zone or the desired area. Where those circles occur on the years, those were years in which the Elite 2 pruning weights were significantly lower than the herbicide control, which is the line pretty much at the top throughout the graph. Okay? Another way to look at, so we have that picture with the lines, and then we have this picture with some of the same data. So from 2005 through 2009, the pruning weights were trending down. And you might say, why is that? Well, one of the answers is time. As things get older, you tend to slow down, right? So if you look at the control, the herbicide with no root pruning, so just typical treatment, over that period of time, you got about a 6% drop in pruning weight. So we could pretty much attribute that to time. Then when we add root pruning, we get about a 17% drop. When we add grass and no root pruning, we get about a, 26% drop. And then finally 39 or close to 40% drop when we both root prune and impose grasses. So that is another way to look at. This is a 39% reduction in pruning weights compared to control over that 6-year period. This was interesting, and I never really have yet to this day fully explained it. If you look at what grass does in reduction of pruning weights, 8%. When you look at root pruning, it's 7. That should add 15, but it actually is 24. And this goes on throughout. So we have 11 do the grass and 7 do the root pruning, but when you put them both, you get a 39% reduction. It's interesting. Looking at Rivaz, or the crop load index, we can see that the one that came closer, and Cain made a point of this, and it's exactly the experience I had. I never got crop loads between 5 and 10, certainly never near 10. But with the Elite 2, I was able to get it to 4.77, which was significantly different than the other treatments. So this one was, if you're going to use crop load or the Rivaz index, then the Elite 2 gets you closer. And beside that, you see a visual. So these were the control vines on the bottom. This is during the winter pruning in 2016, and these are the control vines. So you can see physically they were altered. Just a few numbers here. And the reason I put, you're not going to look at them, but the point is there's very few to no yield penalty with these treatments, with the exception of where those red circles occur, and that was due to root pruning a few times. So overall, the cover crops had little to no effect on yield. Especially note that 2006 year. Remember when I didn't crop thin? And the yields are almost doubled, but yet there's no difference between the treatments and the control in that 2006 year. So I've given you a little bit of the what happened, right? I did a lot of measurements there, and then I decided, well, what's the why? And so you got to think that the roots had something to do with it. So what we did here is we dug soil pits and extracted soil. Actually, we extracted 300 of these soil blocks that were about 400 cubic centimeters. We sieved them, and we extracted the roots from each one of those 400 cubic centimeter blocks. And then we sized the roots into 3 different sizes, weighed them, got the biomass, and we also measured them. So this is the way we're trying to quantify differences between the herbicide and the cover crop. We built this little thing. It's just the square that would extract. That's the size of each square, of each one of the 300 squares we extracted, and looked at the roots. This is just a visual that you can, those pits were beside the vines. These pits were across the row or underneath the vine. So I wanted to see, and just as many of you suspect, well, Gill, if you're cutting the roots, what happened to them? You know, they're going to put out more roots, right? And that's exactly, you'd be exactly right. So look in that green circle, and you can see the witch's broom effect. When we cut the root, we got all that new growth put out there. That's an interesting phenomenon if you dig into it a little deeper, because most of the absorption in these things happens at those root tips. So you're giving it more absorptive capacity. But you get this dip in vigor in the top while it's forming those new tips. Then, to quantify some of that root work, we fitted it to an asymptotic equation. This equation measures root occurrence as depth increases. And so what it gives you is this figure at the end, this number, that 0.95, 0.97. 0.97 to 0.98 is what Smart and his group at UC Davis found when they reviewed about 200 different articles that looked at roots around the world over time. So we were in the ballpark, And our roots really hadn't changed that much despite the insults we would put upon them with the root pruning and the cover crops. And that's the take-home of this slide here. Although you do see a little bit of a difference in the Kentucky 31, where those numbers at the top, we get most of the roots occurring before you get past 60 centimeters in depth. So you're approaching 18 inches to 2 feet, and we're getting about 90% of the roots occur from that deep up. There's a couple reasons for that. These soils increase in bulk density with depth. They also increase in acidity, or the pH goes way down. You'll get pHs of 4 or even a little bit below. So these roots don't like to go much deeper than that, despite your abuse of them. So remember the big blocks of soil? Wasn't happy with it, so came back in 2014 and did a little bit higher tech extraction of roots with this. If you look at this tool here, we drove a cylinder about 2 inches in diameter. We drove it over 1 meter deep, about 1.2 meters. We extracted that core, and then we looked at that for roots. So this was a more efficient root coring method for root research. And part of the outcomes was the big block thing was more representative of what really went on. So I didn't really get much improvement using the soil cores, even though it was much faster. The old soil monolith method had a higher R2 value. And these slides that represent the roots are just to drive home the point that we didn't have a whole lot of effect on the roots, despite the grasses being in place. As far as soil water, what was going on there? If you look at this slide, on your left is the 2007 soil moisture that we collected over a period of time in 2007. We did it several years, but 2007, 2010 were pretty representative. And there's also a dotted line on these slides, below which is the permanent wilting point, meaning that the soils were holding the water so tightly that the plants would probably get to the point where they could not extract that water and would suffer. Well, it didn't matter whether the grasses were in place or not. We didn't get a lot of separation between treatments. So the roots weren't all that affected, and the water was there. Again, one of these years I had 63 inches of rain. So let's look at nitrogen just a little bit. If you look at 2007, there was an effect due to root pruning. We had some differences with the root pruned vines having a lower petiole nitrogen compared to the non-root pruned across the grasses in the herbicide control. But then in 2009, we had a difference just by cover crop. And we can see in that year the herbicide control was about 1.04, and the Elite 2, I think, was much lower, 0.86. And if you look at all these petiole nitrogens, about 1.2 is considered about all you need to have a good, healthy vine. And there's been some recent work where 0.8 is sufficient. We very seldom got below 0.8 petiole nitrogen. So these things are still fairly vigorous, but we were able to have some impact on nitrogen. If you excuse me, I got to take a drink of water. So I am very happy to be here. I mean, in New Mexico, it hasn't rained between 90 and 100 days before I left. So I'm really enjoying the water. Thank you. This is an interesting slide, and really it's a culmination of 12 years of work. If you look closely, the dotted lines represent the root pruning. So we have herbicide strip. Non-root pruned is that solid olive line at the top. When we root prune the herbicide strip, we get that dotted line. And then we have the Kentucky 31 is the black line. The dotted black line is Kentucky 31 when it's root pruned. And then the Elite 2 is this solid line. And when we root prune it, we get the dotted line. What is it? Those are pruning weights given nitrogen as a covariate. So as nitrogen goes up, measured in the petioles, pruning weights go up. Makes sense, right? Until you look at the slopes of these lines, and they are significantly different. So there's the herbicide control. As you put more nitrogen on the herbicide control, it goes up at an increasing rate. Makes sense. When you root prune it, you get a little bit, when you root prune all three, either the grasses or the herbicide, you get a little bit of depression in the pruning weights for a while, but if you add more nitrogen, you can overcome that. And you do so when you get out here. But look at that flat line. That's the Elite 2. So even when you're adding more nitrogen, the pruning weights stay fairly static. Remember the 12 years of pruning weights? Remember how Elite 2 was down in that magic zone? It's here again. So what's the take home for you as a grower or winemaker if you see that? You can play with nitrogen. There's been some recent work by Russell Moss and some others that would indicate that you can apply nitrogen and manipulate flavors and aroma in the harvested fruit. I'm not saying to do that, I'm just saying the door is open to take a look at that. This is a more complete data set on the right, 2010, 2014, and 2007, including 2017. And this is where I ignored root pruning and just looked at the grasses. This line, this regression line, never over the course of those nitrogen rates does the herbicide strip get below where you need it to be as far as pruning weights. Some of the grasses do. So this is a straight regression. This is a ANCOVA, where the nitrogen is held as a covariate. And those are just some significant differences between those slopes, these values here. And then if you look at what happened to the berries, we were able to manipulate yan levels. And if you can look at them there, the herbicide strip, quite a bit higher compared to the Kentucky 31 fescue. And that trend holds over time until we get towards the end where they tend to come together again. And that's somewhat reflected in those pruning weights. If you remember back to the slide of the 2017 pruning weights, again, they were trending upwards or sticking together and not significantly different. So this was an axillary slide compared to really what was in those published papers, and it might be of interest to you as a grower. It was to me, as the viticulturist at that vineyard. We used to treat with herbicides religiously. We used 2 applications of Chateau or 1 of Allion, and we used generic Roundup where we could find it. And if we needed to, we would apply paraquat-type compound, gramoxone, towards closer to harvest to knock down some of the more rampant weeds. So if you looked at the cost involved, you can see that we were spending quite a bit of money on Chateau, or if you went with the Allion route, or if you added a gramoxone route. And we didn't spend any where the grasses were in place. Not to say there weren't costs involved there, they just weren't herbicide costs. Then if we look at pruning time, and I only did this one year, was the last year. I did it about 2 months ago when we pruned so I could have this data set. And we did get a difference. If you look at Kentucky 31, the root pruned, it took about 2.58 minutes a vine to prune them. And then if we looked at the herbicide strip vines, we get about 3.08 minutes. It works out to about 6 hours per acre. So a total of somewhere 60 to 75 hours of labor saved in that vineyard if you were to have all the vines at this size instead of this size. So what are the impacts? Inter-row ground covers, the grass under the vines, can reduce pruning weight. Pretty much prove that. Vine vigor and size, and can maintain vine size over time when root pruning is no longer applied. Remember, and I failed to mention this, in 2010, these vines were no longer root pruned. So that pruning weight data from 10 to 17 was without any root pruning. Minimal yield penalty over time, but we have to consider the crop load. And giving those Rivaz index numbers, you'd have to say, or I would submit to you that those vines were vastly undercropped. And then what happens when we don't hedge them? You saw some of the result of that. The Elite 2 fescue would be the grass to use if you were picking one out of this particular bunch of cool season grasses. And then the root pruning works, but what are the cost considerations? And then other benefits that we didn't really quantify is the herbicide use reduction over time and reduction of cultural cost and irrigation mitigation of erosion. And this is just a slide. This is a typical row at that vineyard, as we had some rows that somewhat went up a hillside. You can see pretty substantial erosion when the herbicide is in place. These are clay soils that wash fairly easily. Some references, if you really want to get off in the weeds on this. Acknowledgements, Dr. Tony Wolf, Dr. Molly Kelly, Ciro Velasco Cruz, Josh Heitman in his lab at North Carolina State, Lucas Roberts, who did some of the statistical work. He worked for Amazon. And then all the guys that really got the work done. It was Mary Simmons at the vineyard, then Miguel and his brothers, the Sanchez brothers that have worked there over 20 years. As a matter of fact, Miguel's brother-in-law works down at Benton Lane here in Oregon. And funding support. So thank you for your attention.
All right, I know we're the guys standing between you and your beer, so we've got some questions and a little amount of time for questions, and I've got one up here. No, I don't have any up here. Anybody with Alex?
For both speakers, for the under the vine cover crop, did you mow it at all? And if not, did you see an increased insect pest pressure?
Thank you for that question. We would typically, and I don't want to admit to it, but we would cut it with a weed eater once or twice a year. There was, in one of those references, there was an auxiliary study in which we measured humidity in the field, both with the herbicide and the fescue. There is an increase in humidity when the fescue's in place, so it would increase disease issues, you would think. But in that place, in those conditions, we have disease issues regardless. It's a moot point. And as far as insect pressure, I didn't see increased insect pressure, but I didn't quantify it per se. We do have mites occasionally, not so often. We do have thrips nearly every year, and I know some people spray for those because of scarring on the berries, because it was these flower thrips, but I refuse to spray that insecticide, and I would just, I would not do that spray. And some years we had fairly significant scarring, but it didn't seem to hurt our fruit quality. Cutworms in the spring, very seldom.
Did you let the grasses go to seed before you cut them?
Most years, yes. Despite that orchard grass was not persistent, nor was the perennial ryegrass, which, by the way, we did a nematode study on the perennial ryegrass, and it had significantly more nematodes, just as a sidebar. And then the Aurora Gold, it just would not stand up to tractor pressure at all. So it did persist somewhat under the row, because you couldn't kill it with Roundup. But it just wouldn't stand up to tractor pressure. So we gave up on that one as well.
The creepy red fescue, like I said, it tended to go dormant, and I didn't get to answer this gentleman's question, but yeah, we would go through and do a little, we just had to do a little bit of touching up on it. It just kind of self-thatched itself more than anything, because it was a perennial relatively easy to manage, but the insect question is a good one. It's something that I would echo Gill and just say that we never quantified it, but it was a concern of increasing insect populations. But I don't have objective data to help answer that. Suffice it to say, the type of cover crop you choose is an important consideration.
Yeah, so my question is borderline philosophical. There was some yield data presented that there was not huge effects on yield in a lot of these studies. There was a little bit less quality data presented, and there was not a lot of effects on the quality data that were presented. And I'm just wondering what you guys think about these 27-year-old numbers from Smart and Robinson about what is like the proper amount of kilograms per meter of row, and if I understand that there's a desire to anchor oneself to something and do an experiment and compare your data to, well, these guys wrote a book and they said that this is a not vigorous vine, but you're working in the vineyard and you're looking at the vines and you're farming the grapes and you're looking at the fruit. So I just want to know what you guys think about, are those numbers still good numbers to go by? Or do you think that we need to reconsider what is too much vigor or not enough vigor or whatever, based on different parameters?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Alex. They're benchmarks, and so they kind of stuck their neck out and said that, and so we compare, right? That's what, until someone else, puts those numbers out there that gets widely cited, then I guess we'll continue to cite against them. But yeah, I mean, depending on your cultivar, on the training system, and the environment, with your production goals, all those things are going to swing those numbers drastically. So, if it's vigor, like I said, is it a bad thing? The question is can you manage it, and do you get good fruit off of it? And that's what I think is really practically important. Not always shooting for that. Oh man, if we're not in the pocket of what they said, it's not the end of the world.
I would echo what Cain says. Even though I use the Rivaz index there, I do not believe in it. I think you can get as good an indicator of vine health by just taking the pruning weights.
Hi, you talked about increased humidity in those cover crops. Did you run into any research with frost issues in the spring?
So the question, if I understand it, was about frost given the cover crops being in place. Is that correct?
Levels, and then you get more frost risks in the spring.
Right.
So
Well, that's a great question. We didn't look at that. We did quantify the humidity, and it is greater with the fescue in place. There's no doubt. But is it significant? It was significantly different. Was it practically different than what was already there, given that we have fescues in the interrows? That particular vineyard, when it was put in, was 240 acres. It had a frost machine every 10 to 12 acres. We never saw a difference in frost, even after we downsized a little bit, given that plot compared to the other part of the 18 acres of cab, which was on this little hillside.
that can be a little bit
Just anecdotal.
problematic with some of the higher cover crops leading to frost issues.
Right, I think it's a consideration. I sure do. But in that site, with those conditions in that environment, it wasn't. Not to say we didn't get frost damage, we did.
Can I just go back to Alex's question real quick one time? Can I? The other thing is too is that the Rivaz index, if I'm in Patty or Paul might have, or even Gill, I think that was developed by a guy named Partridge in a Concord vineyard. I think it was, which is a more sprawl type situation where the pruning weight really has a nice relationship to exposed leaf area. When you take that and apply it to a VSP, you take all that leaf area and smash it together, so you uncouple that relationship. So I would say the Rava's index itself, especially in a VSP situation, is not really indicative of much. However, in a more sprawl situation where those pruning weights are nicely related to the exposed leaf area, I think it might have a little bit more merit. That's it.
I'll just follow up on your point, Cain. Rava's never used the Rava's index. He used it as an indicator for diseased vines. And if you read Mark Matthews' book from UC Davis, he explains that in historical detail. Rava's himself never used it as the quote-unquote crop load index.
Sorry, thank you.
Well, two questions. One is, did you see any issues with vertebrate pressure, rodents and stuff with the grass cover crops? Was that a thing?
Yeah, we saw a little like vole tunneling. We did. We didn't manage them. We just saw that when we did dethatch them, we saw a little bit more vole tunneling. There was a guy named Chuck Ingalls that did a study of the effect, and Paul and Patty know this. It's like it's like the best paper title ever. It's like the effect of cover crops on vine performance and gopher activity. and I don't remember what he found, but maybe gopher activity went up. Do you all remember?
It's pocket gophers.
Yeah. Good point.
So if I'll just add to what Cain said, we did see increased vole activity, and I do think we saw increased root borer activity. Can't quantify it, but we did see more root borers when we dug those soil pits.
And then a totally different question. In your rootstock comparative study and the fruit composition that you showed us, was all that fruit harvested at the same time? Or what did you? How do you choose harvest date?
Yeah, that's a good question. We harvested those at the same time. You know, it was the question that we had. Should we try to harvest everything at a target bricks level, or should we just do it by calendar date? And we chose to do it all on the same calendar date.
I was just wondering if some of those differences for the 420A might have been related to late phenology, which that rootstock tends to impart.
That's a good thought. It's possible. I mean, we didn't measure, phenological advancement between rootstocks, but it's a fair thought. Yeah. Good point.
All right, last question.
So what would be your estimation or quantification of the root mass that you were impacting with the root pruning? Any thoughts, estimations?
Would you mind repeating the question?
It's that southern accent I've got. What is your estimation or quantification of the root mass you were impacting by pruning?
That's a great question. When you root prune those things, and given the vine spacing they were at, we estimated that we restricted them to 33% of the root volume they would have had if we had not root pruned them. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, pretty much.
So, instead of putting a root bag, essentially by blocking that soil, it had 33% of the root volume to explore, as opposed to the untreated vines. Yep.
So we're about 15 minutes over. Thank you for your patience. Let's give these guys a round.